all dressed up, and I respect that. I really like that about you, Wayne, already. So bring us your experience, strength, and hope, love. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
My name is Wayne Butler. I'm an alcoholic. Grateful to be here, great to be sober. Thanks, Eric, for inviting me to come share. Thank my sponsee, Kim, for showing up to support. All my other sponsees that I invited must be into their own lives right now. I'll punish them for that. We'll do some sponsoring tomorrow, I can tell you that right now. I love AA. I love being a part of AA. My sobriety date is November 8th, 1977. So I've had no booze, pills, powders, potions, or lotions. From that day to this, I raised my hand at about 12:10 p.m. on the 8th of November for the first time, said, my name's Wayne, I'm an alcoholic. Prior to that, I went to meetings for 5 years and 5 days, but I'm not an alcoholic. I got enticed to go to a meeting because someone promised me a handout. That's why I went. It's the only reason I went. That he's going to feed me and give me, that's how I heard it anyway. And I went to those meetings because those people were friendly to me. They invited me back. They gave me a couple of cigarettes. They bought me a cup of coffee after the meeting and a piece of pie. And I thought, I like these guys. I think I'll hang out, even though I'm not an alcoholic. When other people would ask me to introduce myself, I figured out that you give a diagnosis because they said I'm alcoholic. That's a diagnosis. So I would give them one of my 21 psychiatric diagnoses. I'd say I'm ADD or OCD. I remember my sponsor said he's an alcoholic, and I said, well, I'm ADD. And he says, I'll bet you are. And I said, you know what else I am? Because I'm trying to impress him now. He said, what's that? I'm OCD. He said, I'll bet you are. Then he said, I think you might be ODD as well. Folks, in 1977, it was the DSM-3, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry. And in the DSM-3, there is no diagnosis of ODD. So I asked him, I said, what's that? He said, you are very odd, is what you are. And that's how we started it. He appointed himself my sponsor, which didn't mean anything to me because I'm not an alcoholic. But if he wants to sponsor me, that's fine, because I interpreted sponsorship, I mean, he's going to pay my way. That's kind of how I saw sponsorship. I had no idea what this AA thing was. I wasn't interested in all that talk about drinking. I just wanted to get on with the business of drinking. But on November 8, 1977, like I said, it was 5 years and 5 days to the day that I was prompted by a new guy. I was introducing myself to him like Barney did to me, and I didn't know what to say to him. I heard myself say, well, I'm Wayne and I'm an alcoholic. And I couldn't believe I said it. Now it's cat's out of the bag. I just joined AA. And that's how I came to admit I was an alcoholic. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it for a minute, but I said it. So I knew I was screwed right then and there. And my self-appointed sponsor heard me say it, and he was shocked. He was struck by shock because he'd been waiting for me to say those words for a long time. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not get me to say that phrase, I'm Wayne, I'm an alcoholic. And so from that day to this, I've not found it necessary to take a drink of alcohol or anything else. By the grace of God, the power of 12 steps and a fellowship that's very important to me. You know, I come from an alcoholic home. I don't want to get into all that too much. I can make myself cry thinking about my childhood. And I'm a victim's victim, I have to tell you. I can run a victim thing. You know, my sponsor says we ought to back a U-Haul up to your head. He says, we need to move you out of that victimhood into a new neighborhood. And he just thought he was funnier. Thought he was funny as all get out. I was 27 years old when I took my last drink. My sponsor was 67, and he was the youngest guy in the group. The other 6 men were ranged in age from 84 to 91, and they said things like, if you want what we have, and I'm thinking osteoporosis. That's what I'm thinking. And I wasn't, all I know is they bought me cigarettes and they gave me food. And that kept me coming back for 5 years and 4 days. And I'm grateful for that. I'm not an alcoholic. I only drink beer. And you know what's interesting? I think it's important to become an alcoholic as soon as possible in my talk, because if I start telling my story, you might think I'm in the wrong room because of my variety of psychiatric diagnoses. as I said, I've been diagnosed 21 different psychiatric diagnoses. I was medicated from the age of 9 to the age of 27. I've been psychiatrically institutionalized 17 times, not once for alcoholism. I was in the Watertown Insane Asylum 14 times. To be fair, I self-signed in 4 times because that's where my girlfriend lived. That's a true story. My gosh, she was hotter than sliced bread. I have to tell you the truth. She was a diagnosed sociopath. She murdered her family, and she was found not fit to stand trial. So she spent the rest of her life in that psychiatric hospital, and I was on the same wing as her because by then I was a diagnosed psychopath. And hey, Tiffany, we can hear you. There you, thank you. I was a diagnosed psychopath, and she heard there was a psychopath on the ward, and she wanted to meet me. And so we met. I was strapped down in leather restraints when we met. She got into my padded room, and she started telling me her story. I started telling her mine, and her sociopathy and my psychopathy fell in love. I have to tell you the truth. And that's why I self-signed in, because I'd get lonely out on the street, go back and see her. That's a true story, by the way, folks. And that was back in the days of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There weren't many rules, just don't hurt nobody. They would let us do basically whatever we wanted on that nut ward. And I didn't mind being there, I guess I could say. And they never ever talked about drinking because I only drink beer, and I wasn't a daily drinker yet. I was a periodic drinker. I didn't understand what an alcoholic was. I believed all those diagnoses. I took the medication they gave me. I didn't abuse that medication. They kept trying to help me. It's not their, now I know because of my work in AA, they couldn't help me because of the dynamic of what being alcoholic and having alcoholism is like. So I'm really grateful for our literature, and not just a big book. You know, I'm a recovered big book thumper, and I want you to hear that. I'm a recovered, my sponsor called me a big book thumping, one book wonder. All I did was preach the big book. All the answers were in the big book. I hadn't even read the book yet, but I'd mimic other people. I'd say, all the answers were in the big book. And he says, you big dummy, you didn't read page 164, did you? I said, what do you mean? He says, it says right there, we realize we know only a little. So how can all the answers be in that book? And that kind of shocked me a little bit. He says, we have other approved literature that the rest of the answers are in. And I encourage you to read those books, the 12 and 12 and AA Comes of Age, the history book, and open your mind up to the possibilities of Alcoholics Anonymous. He says, you get all hooked up on that one book and you might miss the whole package. And that isn't putting anybody down that believes the big book has all the answers. It did not have all the answers for me. And to this day, it does not have all the answers for me. I have a lot of answers in the 12 and 12. I get a lot of answers from As Bill Sees It. I get a lot of answers from Pass It On, from Dr. Bob and Good Old Timers. There's answers everywhere in the approved literature of Alcoholics Anonymous to deal with treating what's called alcoholism. And I did not know any of that on November 8, 1977. And with all those psychiatric diagnoses I came into AA with, I honestly did not believe you guys could help me. I looked around that room of old people that, I mean, half of them were bent over and couldn't straighten back up again. And I'm this this insane whippersnapper, they called me. These were a bunch of blue-collar farmers. You know, if you ever met those guys, they're no screw-around type of people. They're all business. I'm so grateful I landed in there in the midst of those guys. But what makes me alcoholic is so important because my sponsor pointed out that there's 8 chapters to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought it went through page 160. That's another thing that I mimicked. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous is the first 164 pages. My sponsor said, you're a special kind of stupid. The program ends at page 103. Where'd you get this page 164 stuff? Oh, you've been listening to meetings, haven't you? You haven't been checking out the reality of what people say. He says the program ends at page 103. The program is the 12 steps. That's how I got my education in AA. He was a smart, but the guy was well versed in art history, and he laid that. My first grand sponsor was a guy out of Cleveland, and his story's in the big book. And when I met this grizzled old man, he took me to Florida just to meet him because he retired from Cleveland to Florida. And he wanted me to meet his sponsor. so that I could understand what the sponsorship thing is like in Alcoholics Anonymous. And Clarence Snyder was my grand sponsor. And he was alive for the first few years of my sobriety. And it was so cool to sit there and listen to my sponsor and his sponsor talk about the history of early AA. And I began getting, and I'm going to use the word indoctrinated because that's what it was. They were indoctrinating me into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm so glad they did, because in my 46 years of sobriety, one day at a time, there is so much, this is just my opinion, but I think it's accurate. There's so much non-AA crap that's creeping into our fellowship that a newcomer doesn't know if they're doing AA or AAA. And because I've been given this upbringing in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, I can filter out what that is, and I can help my sponsees avoid getting caught up in all that malarkey that has absolutely nothing to do with our work. And you might think I'm kind of extreme, but I'm really not. I'm just an AAer. My sponsor says, I want you to become an AAer. If you expect to stay sober for the long term, you got to become an AAer. And, you know, I was spouting off psychiatric information. I sounded pretty smart when you think about it. I mean, I've had so much psychiatry thrown at me. I got all the answers, folks. I didn't even know that. But them old timers were trying to penetrate the shield of psychiatry I came into AA with. But you know what? They did it with fun. They had fun with me. They laughed a lot. I wasn't laughing so much, but they were laughing a lot. And they just say things like, keep coming back. And oh my goodness. Well, my sponsor, he said, there's 8 chapters in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which includes the doctor's opinion. And he said, I want you to read those chapters. Now, I want you to read the first 4 chapters, because he knew something I didn't know. The first 4 chapters are all about step 1, which to me, even as knuckleheaded as I am, 4 chapters out of 8 devoted to step 1 suggest to me that step 1's pretty important. I mean, even a dummy like me got that. I'm like, wow, 4. But you see, I'm a loophole looker. Anybody else? Are there any other loophole lookers in the audience? So I'm in there looking for the loopholes in those 4 chapters, and I found them. I found everything that makes me not alcoholic. And I don't know if I was consciously doing it. I don't think so. It was just what I was doing. You see, I've never had a morning drink in my life. I never switched drinks, ever. I never did any geographics. I found Skid Row and stayed there. It was like divinity for me. And so when I was reading the doctor's opinion and reading Bill's story, I've been to war, I've been to Vietnam, but I didn't have the same type of thought process. So that's not me. I mean, I found all the loopholes in the first 4 chapters, therefore not alcoholic. And my sponsor would constantly say to me, you're reading the gray area, you're not reading the black stuff. And I said, what? It's like I was out of my mind. And I was drinking an awful lot too, by the way. My heavy drinking started after I came to AA. I met you people and I got thirstier. Jesus, God Almighty. I listened to you guys and I'd have to go drink. I'd go to Larry's Oasis and talk about you people. I'd say, you ought to hear what these crackpots are saying down there. They're trying to make me be an alcoholic. Give me another Budweiser. And there'd be a Budweiser on the bar. They had as much fun with me at Larry's Oasis as these old timers were having with me at the meeting. And I had no idea. I didn't know if I was whining my ass or scratching my watch. I mean, it was just and then they had me making coffee. And I thought, why do I gotta make coffee? I don't want to make coffee. So I made coffee, and I made terrible coffee. Ryan, I made bad coffee. I knew if I made bad coffee, they'd fire me. Well, you know what? It's hard to get fired from a commitment when no one else wants the commitment. And so I made this, you're supposed to put 2.5 scoops of grounds in this coffee pot. I put in 6. And I couldn't wait to see him. And old Curly. Curly's this gnarly old car body mechanic type guy. And he's like 5'6" and mean as a junkyard dog. And I knew as soon as he tasted that coffee, they'd fire me from that commitment. He comes over to that coffee pot. I'm sitting there by the coffee pot, and he pours that styrofoam cup of coffee, takes a big slug of it, and he starts going like this. That is really stout coffee, kid. Good job. Keep coming back. I thought, well, that didn't work. My God, you cannot get fired from an AA commitment when no one else wants it. I'll tell you that. And I finally surrendered and started putting in 2.5 cups. And And then, you know, within 6 months, I'm not an alcoholic, but I love making coffee for these people. And it's like, they kept giving me little things. They said, keep coming back. I'd give a diagnosis, keep coming back. They wouldn't let me share. They would just let me give a diagnosis. Then I wasn't allowed to talk anymore. That went on for 5 years and 5 days. Thank God. Thank God they said, keep coming back. I did not have a desire to stop drinking. This was an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they had a group conscience on me. They had a group conscience that I could keep coming. And they suspected I might be alcoholic, I guess. I was clearly not. I only drink beer and wine, like Boone's Farm. Have you ever drank Boone's Farm and mixed it with Red Mountain wine? You ever had that? This is an older crowd, I can tell. Some of you know what Red Mountain wine was, don't you? Remember, 99 cents a gallon? I mean, oh my God. I drink Boone's Farm and Red Mountain wine, and I'd puke, and it looked like I was bleeding internally at the meeting. So I'd tell women I was dying from stomach cancer, and they'd feel sorry for me and take me out and give me something to eat to cushion my stomach. I mean, I had the rap going on, you know, but I'm not an alcoholic, by God. I had no idea what was wrong. I was out of my ever-loving mind. I mentioned I come from an alcoholic home because that, if you know, you know. And all the stuff that goes on in an alcoholic home visited me too. And I don't want to get into a victim log, but the fact of the matter is I was victimized as a kid sexually, violently. It was a terrible home. It was a very violent home, very hostile. And that didn't make me alcoholic, but I'm not going to tell you it didn't have nothing to do with my alcoholism, because I've heard that from people that's like, this didn't make me alcoholic. No, it didn't make, what makes me alcoholic is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. But what I found out later, it has a lot to do with alcoholism. And I didn't understand that either, because I've been therapied by the top-notch therapist in the state of Illinois. They figured if they could fix old Wayne B at the Watertown Insane Asylum, they'd get a medal of some kind, because I was the impossible case. And I was on the violent ward. I was in the criminally insane wing. And it's like, I didn't go to jail anymore. They picked me up, take me right to Watertown. That's where I went. And I kind of liked it, by the way. So what happened after November 8, 1977? Well, my sponsor asked me to read those 4 chapters. I did. I found all the loopholes. I kept saying, Barney, I'm not an alcoholic. I don't relate to that. And he said, okay, all right. And then he kept trying to get me to read chapter 4, which is, of course, the 5th chapter when you consider the doctor's opinion. And I read the title of that chapter, and if you know chapter 4, it's entitled We Agnostics, right? Well, my sponsor wanted me to read that, and I said, Barney, I'm a Christian. I can't read that chapter. I said, if I read that chapter, God's going to think my faith is not true. Why do I need to read that chapter? I'm a Christian. And he looked at me, and here's his exact words. You are a special kind of stupid, ain't you? And it's like, I didn't like that so much. But I'm not reading. He finally coerced me into reading that chapter. And who would know that Bill took the doctor's opinion and the first 3 chapters and condensed them into one sentence with no loopholes. And if I had not read this page, I don't believe I'd be here with you guys today. I don't believe I would have stayed. And here's it. And I want to read that sentence to you if you don't mind. I'm going to put it in the first person because that's how it affected me. It says, if, I know what that word if means. That's a condition. I may be retarded, but I know what that word if means. And by the way, I don't mean no offense to people with special kids, but I was diagnosed mentally retarded in 8th grade. You know, they don't know how to deal with kids from alcoholic families. They gave me the IQ test in the 8th grade trying to get a beat on my crazy behavior. I mean, I'm biting people, crayons, I'm eating pencils. I get up out of my chair and run head first into the wall for no good reason except it's there. And so they trying to figure out what's wrong with Little Wayne. That's my nickname from school. And they gave me the IQ test. And how many of you have taken the IQ test? Raise your hand. Seriously. Call me out if I'm wrong. If you score 100, you're pretty smart. You score a 120, you're borderline genius. You score a 150 or above, there's an organization called Mensa that will recruit you, sit in rooms and think for people that'll pay you. Ain't that crazy? I scored a 57. and I didn't cheat, by the way. I didn't cheat. And I got diagnosed mentally retarded, and I got put in a mentally retarded group home. And it was at first better than that alcoholic home, and then it turned bad. And I don't want to go into all that because it's not necessary. But it set me up for a thing called alcoholism. But so when I came to AA, I was retarded, and I wore it like a badge of honor. I did. I got so much sympathy from that one diagnosis that I carried that diagnosis right into AA with me. Because there's, it's like when you got a condition like that, you can't be expected to do nothing. Like read. I can't read. By the way, I could not read legibly. I couldn't write legibly. I didn't get an education in school. They shielded me all through school after I got diagnosed retarded. They didn't know what to do with this. They didn't have any of the things they have now for special ed kids who have either dyslexia or they're being damaged at home. So when I read this, bear in mind I'm looking for a loophole. It says, if, when I honestly want to, do I find I cannot quit drinking entirely? There's no loophole there. I tried it. There's no loophole. When I honestly want to, I knew what the word honest meant. Do you find you cannot quit drinking entirely? Guys, I tried to drink. When I was in the United States Navy, I finally fit in for the first time in my life without a drink. I fit in the United States Navy. I loved it there. When I went to Vietnam, I was okay there. I knew what to do. I knew where to go, what to do. And when I could get off the ship and go drink, that made it even better. But we was in Subic Bay, Philippines, and I'm not supposed to go drinking on Sunday night when the ship's going to pull out on Monday morning. But I met this brown-eyed, brown-haired little Filipina gal, so cute, and she thought I was the cat's meow. And I thought, well, I better have a drink with her. I better have at least one. And then she wanted one, and then maybe let's have another one. And pretty soon, I'm not at the bar no more. I'm at her place. And I wake up Monday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'm supposed to be on that ship. So by the time I get back to the ship, it ain't there. It's gone. And they left without me. By the way, they frown on that. And that's the first time someone called me alcoholic. They said, you got to go to treatment. I said, I'm not an alcoholic. I only drank beer. I refused to go to treatment. And so they gave me the option, go to treatment or we're going to discharge you. Guys, I made a horrible decision, but it made sense to me at the time. I took the discharge. I shamed myself. I humiliated myself. I cut myself out of a career that I wanted. I wanted to quit drinking, folks, but I couldn't. And I didn't understand why. Remember where Bill wrote how it works? Alcohol. He didn't say disease. That's not an AA word. That's a made-up word from science. It says alcohol. Cunning, baffling, and powerful. And guys, it was baffling to me that I couldn't quit drinking. And here's why. Even though I'm a knucklehead, I'm diagnosed retarded, I know one thing about alcohol. Scientific fact, it's not addictive by nature. Alcohol is not an addictive substance. People say, well, how come you didn't do drugs? They had heroin in Vietnam. I've been around drugs my whole life. But why the hell do I want to do drugs? They're addictive. I understood. Isn't that something? I understood drugs are addictive, so I'm not doing them, and I haven't done them to this day. But alcohol is not addictive, and that's why I was so baffled by it, why I couldn't put it down and leave it down. I could go 3 or 4 weeks without a drink, but invariably have to pick one up. I'd be so obsessed with it, and I just didn't understand. I was baffled by that. But there were times when my wife says, if you go drinking, I'm leaving. I went upstairs and packed her bag. Time to go. I didn't know that it's because I couldn't quit drinking. I didn't understand that. So when I read that line, if when you honestly want to, do you find you cannot quit entirely? I knew I couldn't. That's one yes. Then it says, or if when drinking, do I have little control over the amount I take? I said, this is a tough test right here. Or when drinking, do I have little control of the amount I take? I know that's true too, because when I went to Subic Bay, when I went to the bar, I had no intention of drinking more than 1 or 2. No intention of it. But once I took that first drink, I was powerless, and I didn't understand that. It cost me my Navy career. So I didn't understand. Once I take a drink, I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know where I'm going to end up. I don't know where I'm going to go. I have no idea what's going to happen once I pick up that drink. Anybody else had a blackout? How many of us had blackouts? Do you know what the scientific term for that is? I think it's great. I didn't know this. Alcoholic palimpsest. That's the technical term for a blackout. And the reason it says alcoholic palimpsest is alcoholics are the only one that have them from alcohol. Only alcoholics. And I had a blackout first time out of the gate, but I didn't know what the hell that was. So it's a little inconvenient, but it's not too bad. That's another yes. And then it says, you are probably alcoholic. And I went like this. That was close. You are probably alcoholic. There's no definite dust to the word probably. I know what that means. Maybe, could be, but not for sure. So that's what that left me with. And then it goes on to say, if that be the case, I may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. That was baffling to me as well, because there is no disease. I want you to hear this. There is no disease known to science that requires a spiritual experience to recover. If you know of one, please wise me up. But I'm not so much a dummy anymore. I've done my research. There's no disease known to medicine that requires a spiritual experience. That's why I know our founders got this right. An illness, a spiritual malady. And Dr. Silkworth himself, a double board certified neurologist and medical doctor, double board certified, in his opinion, he talks about the allergy and the obsession. I have an allergy to alcohol. And all I know what allergy means is to have an abnormal reaction to. And I have an abnormal reaction to alcohol as evidenced by my life. In other words, it's an abnormal reaction to alcohol to have my perception change while I'm drinking. You see, I understand the science of alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant. That's all it is. It's not a stimulant. Alcohol is a depressant. But it had a stimulating effect on me. That's an abnormal reaction. And I also get better looking when I drink. Anybody else? I get smarter. I get better looking. I get faster, wittier, clever. My personality changed when I get a certain amount of drinks in me. And I don't know it intellectually. I only know it experientially. Dr. Silkworth talks about that in his opinion. He talks about these abnormal drinkers that they drink essentially because they like the effect produced. Now I understand what that means. I drank because, not for the taste, I drank unwittingly trying to pursue that effect produced by alcohol to get me in a state that I call a state of grace. It made me feel normal. I now know what it's called. It's Bill called it extemporaneous, where I take a few drinks and all of a sudden my mind changes, my perceptions changes. Clancy called it disease of perception. I now know what that means. I transform. I have a transformation take place while I'm drinking. Sort of like the 12 promises, how they come true when we're drinking. It's sort of interesting when you're an alcoholic of my type. I didn't know that. And so I got that thing where I understand now what alcoholic is. But it says that let me read that again, just because I think it's important. It says, an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not easy alternatives to face. That's why that's so important, is because there is no other disease known to science that's the truth. That it requires, if we could treat disease, this meeting right here on Zoom would have 1,000 people on it that have cancer, diabetes, tuberculosis, if we had the power to treat disease. What we have the power to treat is exactly what AA is designed to do, and that's the part Dr. Silkworth agreed he couldn't help. Remember at the end of his opinion, he says the only relief, he's talking about the allergy and the obsession, the only relief we have to suggest, the men and women of science and medicine, the only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. That's all medicine had then, and that's all they've got now. They may one day come up with something else, but so far up to today, all they can treat is those two things, the allergy and the obsession. And how do you treat that? Don't drink. But how many of you are like me, and you were restless, irritable, discontent before you ever drank? I was restless and irritable, discontent before I ever took the drink. Do you know Dr. Bob was not like that? Dr. Bob is an alcoholic. Dr. Bob was normal in every regard except for the effect alcohol had on him. As a matter of fact, I found this out, and I'll share it with you because it saved my life. In 1944, Bill Wilson was invited to New York to address the AMA. And I wondered why they didn't invite Dr. Bob. He's a doctor. Why'd they invite this bankrupt stock speculator? Why didn't they invite the doctor? Well, they knew that Dr. Bob, he stayed right there in Akron and administered to 5,000 alcoholics for free. But he never went anywhere. He didn't have his thumb on this developing entity called Alcoholics Anonymous, and Bill did. Bill was the spark plug, albeit neurotic, but he was the spark plug. So they wanted to ask him some questions about this fellowship. So he went, and they asked him several questions, but here's the one that got to me, and I hope it affects you as well. They asked Bill, of your fellowship of men and a handful of women, had they not been drinkers, how would you describe their personality makeups? Ain't that an interesting question? And he answered them right away. He said, well, half would have been normal in every regard. Every able, intelligent, friendly people, except for the effect alcohol has on them. And then he says, the other half, and I can see him waving his hand, would be more or less pronounced neurotic. And you know what? I got that. I'm about as pronounced neurotic as you can get. And drinking, to me, seems to solve that dilemma, as it did with Bill Wilson. And the reason that's important is because that cut through all the psychiatry that I've been dealing with up until the age of 27. And it's like when Dr. Silkworth said the only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence, that tells me that they can't help me once I stop drinking. And that's when I was awakened to this. So what is AA? If AA is not designed to treat disease of any kind, which it's not, what's it designed to do? And that's when I learned about alcoholism. Bill Wilson taught me that from the history about what the ism is, this internal spiritual maladjustment. Once we put down the allergy and the obsession, then what I'm left with is an underlying soul sickness. Thank God for Reverend Sam Shoemaker, who Bill said was, in his opinion, a non-alcoholic co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, because he got a lot of the information of the spiritual nature from Reverend Sam Shoemaker. And what Sam Shoemaker said to Bill was, Bill, I think you guys are suffering from a soul sickness. I think that's what your problem is. Once you stop drinking, you have a soul sickness. And then he elaborated on what that soul sickness was. And as I've stayed sober over the years and taking these 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, what I found out was I came in here soul sick. And you know what's interesting? I came in here with a broken spirit. There's no doubt about it. I was depressed. I was anxious. I was frightened. When I drink, I don't feel that way. But when I'm sober, it's to the 10th power. I feel separate, different, alone wherever I go. Even in AA at the first, I felt separate, different, alone until I started taking these steps. As I started taking the 12 steps, I didn't feel that sense of isolation like I once did. I didn't feel that separation that I felt when I came to AA. I began to get this strong sense of belonging, just like the book talks about after step 5. This strong sense of belonging came. And what I discovered was, unbeknownst to me, my condition is being treated. My condition, this spiritual malady, this internal spiritual maladjustment that I have. And it laid it out. And thank God my sponsor got me to read chapter 4, We Agnostics. I'm not an agnostic. I'm not agnostic to this day. But he, with the help of Reverend Sam Shoemaker, he talked about agnostic temperament and agnostic inclination in chapter 4. And what that means is I lean towards self-doubt. I lean towards my ego. I lean into this manifestation of anti-God. It's like this thing pulls at me, and I separate myself. And what I found out is I've got this ism thing. I've got this internal spiritual maladjustment. And what it means is I'm maladjusted to the spiritual life. I'm in full flight from the great reality. And because of that, I became an outright mental defective. And that summed up my whole psychiatric life. I'm so grateful that my sponsor helped teach me that stuff, and that he got me to read chapter 4 and 5 and got me to where I understood what my condition is. And you know, Bill actually writes in the big book, that we must get a full knowledge of our condition. And he talked about it in a letter that's published in As Bill Sees It, where he says if an alcoholic doesn't get a full knowledge of their condition, they probably won't stay for the long term. If we don't get a full knowledge of our condition. And I want you folks to know something. Because I became a student of Alcoholics Anonymous, I got into that big book, I got into the 12 on 12. Bill called the 12 on 12, the 12-step essays, he called that the supplement. And I had to get educated in AA, and I found out the word supplement means to make complete. Bill wanted to rewrite the big book and put in the information that's in the 12-step essays. We wouldn't let him touch the big book. And it's a good thing we didn't. Look at him trying to mess with it now. And so what he did was he wrote those essays for the 12 and 12, and he called it the supplement. He felt he had now made the big book complete. And if you read the 12-step essays, you can see, and those 12-step essays saved my life. Had I continued to disregard the 12 and 12, because some well-meaning AA people told me to stay away from that book. They said it's Bill's ego. Bill wrote it to make money. And I thought, my sponsor said, instead of having contempt, go find out the history. And so my sponsor sent me on a historical research of where those essays came from. And I found the history of his relationship with Father Ed Dowling from St. Louis, how Father Dowling took Bill back through the 12 steps from 1947 to 1949 in an effort to treat his depression. And Father Dowling diagnosed Bill's depression, and his term was never used before. He used the term spiritual depression. He says, Bill, I believe you have spiritual depression. And we took him back through the 12 steps, and he added components to step 2, 3, 4, 8, 10, and 11. He added components that aren't in the big book, but they are in the 12 and 12, and to treat his spiritual depression. And you know what? Bill took those 12 steps with Father Dowling. His notes became the essays to the 12 and 12. And what happened was Bill recovered completely from that depression. In 1955, and if you read page 231, and as Bill sees it, he codifies it right there, that his depression lifted in 1955 and never returned. That one thing gave me the hope that I could stay sober one day at a time the rest of my life. And it gave me the hope that this stuff will never come back on me again if I just do these simple little things called the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and give it away. And I'll close it, and I'm going to wrap it up with this. I got about 5 or 8 minutes left. One of the things I discovered in Alcoholics Anonymous as I was working these 12 steps is there's 3 phases of 12-step development. And I like this because I use it on newcomers, because newcomers don't know what they're doing and where they're at. And so I think it helps them to know where they're at. So I discovered in my step studies that there's 3 phases of 12-step development: desperation, restoration, and transformation. And I think there's a lot of hope embedded in those 3 things: desperation, restoration, and transformation. And I'll tell you what they look like in real time. Desperation, the gift of, G-O-D, gift of desperation. I believe it was a gift, because had I not been having the desperation of dying, I would have never turned my will of my life over to anything or anybody. I was desperate for a new way of life by the time we got to that part of the big book and the part of the steps, and I was willing to follow my sponsor's direction. I used to say I never argued with him, but that's not quite true. I never argued with him. I argued in my head. You ever done that with your sponsor? Argued in your head but kept your mouth shut and did it anyway? I called him all kinds of names in my mind, and I would say, yes, sir. God, I hated him sometimes. I would have never taken those first 3 steps if I wasn't desperate. If I wasn't desperate. And then the second phase of development, the restoration, we all know about phase 2. It's talked about in the promises. If we had been painstaking about this phase of our development, we'll be amazed before we're halfway through. Halfway through is step 6 and 7. Isn't that interesting? Halfway through the restoration phase to step 6 and 7. And I got to tell you, I was becoming amazed by the time I got there. And I want to share about that. That's Chuck Chamberlain called that the duality step, where being restored to soundness of mind where alcohol is concerned. I have been restored to sanity where alcohol is concerned, because Dr. Silkworth told me that I can't drink alcohol in any form at all, in any amount at all, safely. And I'm so glad he put that word safely in there, because had he not put that word safely in there, there's not a doubt in my mind I'd have tried to drink again. But I know from my own experience that I can't drink alcohol safely. And so I've been restored to sanity just for today in that regard. But Chuck taught me about a duality to that. He said the other one is being restored to sanity where life itself is concerned, being restored to citizenship, being restored to a way of life outside in the earth world where I can become a operating participant in the way of life out there in the earth world. And he didn't say live life on life's terms, because that's what I was doing when I came here. Everyone, in my opinion, feel free to disregard it. Every one of us come in here living life on life's terms. We're just not very good at it. But my sponsor said, no, you got it wrong, you big dummy. You got it wrong. We're going to, and I thought it was the play on words. You know, Dr. Paul talked about acceptance being the answer, right? Acceptance is the answer to all his problems. And my sponsor said, no, you're backwards here, kid. He says, what you have to do is accept life on life terms, live it on God's terms. And that almost made me puke a little bit in my throat. He said, what we do in AA is we learn to accept life on life terms, but we learn to live it on God's terms. And I just wanted to slap him because I knew it was probably true. And so by living life on God's terms gives me a chance to live a life free of the bondage of self, to give me a chance to join the mainstream of life that I never wanted to participate in, to overcome all the labels that followed me into AA, to overcome the belief I was retarded. Excuse me. So I've been restored to sanity just for today. And I had to do steps 4 through 9 to clear away the wreckage of my past and change a lot of my old ideas so that I could recover fully. So he was right. Steps 4 through 9. You know what the Chuck C called the steps 1 through 9? He called it the dying steps. And he called 10, 11, and 12 the living steps. When I had 18 days of sobriety, Chuck C said to me, "Kid, you get on with the business of dying, so you get on with the business of living." And I thought, what the hell does that mean? Get on with the business of dying. Ain't I here to be living? And now I understand what he meant. Die to my old self, so I could reborn to my new. and then phase 3, steps 10, 11, and 12, the transformation phase. You see, I've been a daily proponent of steps 10, 11, and 12. I was taught to work them collectively, that they're a joint mission to do steps 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis. And thank God Father Dowling solved Bill's depression by using the page of the prayer of St. Francis, and taught Bill how to break it down and use it as his meditation for a racing mind and an anxious soul. And so I found that in history, what Bill did with Father Dowling, and I took that under my wing in 1985, and I have been using the St. Francis prayer, breaking it down sentence by sentence every day since 1985, and my life has been transformed. I don't look nothing like if you knew me 10 years ago and you're judging me according to that, you got the wrong guy. That's why I'm not going to, if you've been around a while, if I knew you and I didn't see you for 10 years, I'm automatically going to assume you've probably changed. And then if your behavior says something otherwise, that's different. But I know I've been changed, and I found out that I'm not the change agent. The 12 steps are. No steps, no change. And so that third phase of my development, I'm still living in. I'm being by the way, I'm being transformed right here and right now. I'm not going to leave this meeting the same guy I was when I walked in here. Something's happening, and it's always happening if I just keep an open mind and keep coming back here and accepting these gifts that AA provide for me, that God and AA. And I'm of the belief that God and AA are synonymous. I didn't get lost in God. I've always believed in God, but God never kept me sober before I got to AA. So God ain't going to keep me sober after I got to AA. And God knows that, which I believe is why he created AA through Bill and Bob and those first 100 members, because he knew we were the type of people that wouldn't stay sober on God alone. So he gave us this program to keep us sober. Whatever you believe is none of my business, but I absolutely believe this program was given to me to keep me sober. And I thank God every night when I go to bed for giving me AA. And I thank AA for keeping me sober. So I've got God in one hand, AA in the other. There's no place left to pick up a drink. If I can remember that just one day at a time, try to grow in this process, train my sponsees to become AAers. And if they don't want to be trained, then I tell them they got the wrong sponsor. There's plenty of sponsors available. It doesn't got to be me, but I'm going to train you. Because my training, when I went to boot camp, I learned a valuable lesson. I'll close with this. My sponsor literally trained me in AA because he knew I had a head full of psychiatry. So he says, we're going to have to wash that out with a head full of AA. And he said, we're going to train you the AA way. And he used my military service to convince me to do it. He said, do you believe you would have survived Vietnam if you hadn't been trained? I said, absolutely not. And he said, your training kept you alive. Training and good luck. I used to say, God got me out of there. And he said, oh, you're special. You're special. All those people that died, but you got out there because he kept you alive. Aren't you a special kind of stupid? He said, your training kept your ass alive. Training and good luck and good people that got trained around you. And I believe that's true about AA. I believe that many of us are not training our newcomers the AA way. I believe a lot of newcomers are being trained the therapy way, the treatment way, the psychiatry way, the medicine way, but they're not being trained the AA way. And I fear for them because they're not getting the AA message without it being watered down. And I'm responsible to do something about that in my own little circle of life. I've been fired by a lot of sponsees because I'm pretty devout with that idea that I want them to become AAers. And I don't blame them for firing me because they don't want to do it. I don't blame them. Good luck. It's like the acid test. How's that working for you? If it's working for you, there's no argument, is there? And so I had a sponsor, as I said, that was a no nonsense guy. I love him. When he died, a part of me went with him. And then I realized, no, God's not a taker. God's a receiver. I've got another angel looking after me. That's when I realized that God doesn't take, he receives. And I've had many people in my life die. And at first, it really bothered me that they were dying, obviously. And then one day, my sponsor says to me, he says, "Kid, you gained an angel." He said, "God doesn't take. That's spiritual intoxication. God receives." And I've had that belief system from then on. And I'm going to hang in there with that one belief because when my fellows, most of my heroes in AA have passed away now. I've got heroes in AA. My first 6 members of AA that were speakers at my convention that I went to when I was 17, 18, and 19 days sober was a guy named Chuck Chamberlain, Norm Alpe, Clancy I, Johnny 8, Dottie Shore, and Tom Brady Jr. And all 6 members of AA, they hooked me that weekend. They hooked me into keeping coming back. I didn't understand half of what they were saying, but somehow they went right past my head and went right to my spirit. And now I understand why. That's one of the reasons I try to keep my talk centered on AA and not bring in all these extraneous things that I've learned along the way that has nothing to do with our AA work here. And I do that for the sake of the newcomer, that they don't know if they're winding their ass or scratching their watch. I'll leave it there. Thank you for letting me share.